While listening to the Old Testament, I imagined that King David had settled in and felt very comfortable in his new home. So he called the prophet Nathan and alluded to his desire to prepare a temple, a permanent dwelling place for the Lord, right there in Jerusalem. Nathan agreed. However, the Lord stepped in. He said no. No by the way of Nathan. He said no to David's plans. Nathan listened to God, believed, and readily let go of his own wishes, as did David. And what was the result? Well, more than David had ever imagined. Because David didn't build a house for the Lord. Instead, he prepared a way for a dynasty. A lasting dynasty because of his faith, his belief in the Lord. And then, while listening to the gospel, I wondered why. Why only in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke do you find the mention of the birth of Jesus? Mark begins his gospel with the appearance of the adult John the Baptizer and the adult Jesus. And John begins with these familiar words. In the beginning was the Word. But there's no birth story. So when and why did Luke write this gospel? More than likely, Luke was written after Mark and Matthew, which would date it well after 70 AD, after the fall of Jerusalem, and after the Roman destruction of that stone temple built by King Solomon. The temple was God's one and only dwelling place on earth. Can you imagine how the ancient Jews felt after that destruction? They must have been demoralized, in despair, because a destroyed temple was not just a ruined building. To them, the temple meant that God no longer dwelt with them. David's kingdom was gone. They were as good as abandoned. So Luke starts his book with events before the destruction of the temple. Luke writes that God loved his people so much that he sent the angel Gabriel to prepare for a new kingdom. First, Gabriel met with Zechariah, a priest in the temple, and when Zechariah heard Gabriel's surprising news, Zechariah couldn't change his old ways. He couldn't believe. He froze. He lost his voice. Luke says that Zechariah didn't have faith. He didn't believe. But Zechariah's lack of belief did not stop the Lord. Because several months later, God sent Gabriel again, this time to a small town in Nazareth, to Mary, a young peasant girl who was probably about 12 years old. She was a child, but old enough to be engaged to Joseph. And the angel Gabriel tells Mary, first, do not be afraid, but to listen, because she is going to have a son, whom she will name Jesus, and he will be a king, and his kingdom will last forever. And Mary, this child, says, and how's that going to happen? And Gabriel replies, God will make it happen, not Joseph. Not Joseph. Well, can you imagine Mary's confusion, fear, but most likely her horror? Remember, in those days, an engagement was a formal and binding contract with very specific rules and responsibilities. Under the old Jewish law, if Mary became pregnant before the marriage and the baby was not Joseph's, Joseph could have her charged with adultery and then have her and her unborn child stoned to death. But Gabriel reassured Mary. Gabriel said this. He said, nothing is impossible with God. Mary pondered, and then she let go of her own fears and wishes, and she replied, I am the Lord's servant. Let it happen. Now here's a question. Why did Mary believe, but Zechariah, who had to lose, whom we would expect to answer yes, he's the one who lost his voice. He failed to believe. I think his loss of belief has a lot to do with a gift from God, the gift of imagination. Now, we're accustomed to thinking of and using imagination in the most remarkable ways. We use it to benefit the world, like Edward Jenner did when he developed the first successful vaccine, the smallpox vaccine. And like Crick and Watson did when they proposed the double helix structure of DNA. And we use it to challenge and better ourselves, as when we return to school after a long absence, or climb mountains, or run races, or even when we figure out what to put together for the next meal. We use imagination for the worldly as well as the holy. The holy, like King David and the prophet Nathan did, and Zechariah didn't. But Mary did. When God called to her, she answered yes to imagination and to belief. So is that the reason for Luke's narrative of the birth of Jesus? That we shouldn't follow Zechariah's example, but instead we should have faith and belief like Mary? No. The miraculous story of the birth of Jesus is not a story about Mary and her faith and her belief. This is a story about God. How his plans weren't to remain in that old kingdom, confined by us in a stone temple. No. Luke tells us how God was there from the beginning, and he always will be. He will not leave us. And it's about how God prepared a new kingdom for us, where he walks and dwells, not in some specific place, but where he walks and lives with us. And it's about how he invites us, how he taps our hearts, the hearts of those of us with great imagination and great belief, as well as those of us with not so much imagination and not so much belief. And when I imagine God and his love, I think of Father Tom's description of the picture of Mary's child, Jesus, standing there at the door of our heart and tapping ever so gently. And remember that door has no handle. It can only be opened from the inside by us. Jesus has to be invited in. I imagine, I believe, he's inviting us into our new kingdom, not just to walk and talk with him, but to minister, to do, to work with him in this new kingdom. And now, when Jesus comes tapping at our hearts, yours and mine, how will we use our imagination, our belief? Before we answer Jesus, will we remember that Jesus will walk the walk with us, like he did with King David, Mary, and even Zechariah? He will not abandon us. And when Jesus calls, as he surely will, and that might be kind of scary, will we remember the good news, the reassurance, the good news that Gabriel gave to Mary, to you and to me, that in this new kingdom, nothing is impossible